This week on the Eldritch Lorecast,
Dimension 20 have recently put out a game completely for free.
We made it so that you can fly a helicopter to the moon.
You know, I'm like making a list of all the game design stuff, and I'm like,
Two a year? The only way to do that is if the games are and the developers are overworked.
Well, you just described the whole game industry right there. So
Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast are trying to erase Gary Gygax's influence on the game.
That remember that this caveat is at the beginning of a 500-page book honoring these guys' creation.
there seems to be this idea in the C-suite world, well, if this company did it, then we can do it. So we should be able to just throw this money at it and have it work swimmingly. And so far, there has not been a lot of swimming. There's been a lot of drowning.
All that and more right now.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the #1 political commentary podcast in all the realms. That's right. This is where you come to get your spicy political news, is the Eldritch Lorecast. My name is Ben Byrne. If you've never listened to an episode before, this is an interesting one to tune into. I'm here with Shawn Merwin, Bob Worldbuilder, joining us again for James Hake, and Dael Kingsmill. And Dael, I want to ask, what is your favorite one-shot style designed game? Simple rules, played in a session or two, not really designed for an ongoing campaign.
Okay, here's the thing, is that I have a few different answers. And
Okay.
so bear with me. But they're all good. So, of course, I've mentioned a couple times recently, and I played recently on my channel, Dread. I think it's a great game for one-shots in particular. It's just so designed with that in mind, and leads to just a really good kind of arc of building tension if you're just hanging out with friends and want to play an RPG. Then there are a couple of one-page style RPGs or very short sort of indie RPGs that I have played and really, really loved. The first is The Witch is Dead by G.S. Howitt, where you play the familiars of a witch who has been murdered, and you're given some task to try to bring the witch back to life. And you only have like one day to do it or something like that. Like it's got a couple different things, and a friend ran that for us, and it was really fun. I was some kind of like bastard rabbit. It was really, really good. And then also I would love to mention At the Monarch's Gate by Nyasa, which runs, I believe, using a tarot deck. And when I played it, it was really fun. It's basically a whole game built around that trope of in a movie where they get to the fancy party or they get to the castle gate or whatever, and they have to hand over their weapons, and you just keep handing over more and more weapons, and they just keep coming out. And so as you're playing, you have to tell stories about where you got each of these things. And it's a ton of fun as well. So those are my sort of top 3 that came to mind.
Well, I'm definitely going to have to try that Witch's Familiar one. That sounds really fun.
Super fun, super cute.
And perhaps in a similar vein, maybe, because you're playing a little creature, but not as magical per se. But the first one that came to mind was Mouse Ritter. It totally can be extended campaigns, but it is based on the Into the Odd system, also used for like Cairn RPG. And I just recently ran my first session of it with little prep, though I had read the rules before. Yeah, very little prep, and was able to like dive right in because it comes with a little pamphlet that's just like a mini quest. Oh, and actually the one we ran was actually in the rule book. There's just a 2-page spread, in this zine-sized book that has all the information you need to run a session. So it was like perfect. Like I barely had to prep for it. And then the other one that came to mind after Dael mentioned Dread was 10 Candles. I played that for the first time this year.
Right.
And it's definitely built for one-shots because you all die at the end. And it just worked really well. My wife ran it, and none of us had played it before, but she did a great job, and we all had a ton of fun. And we're like, we could all kind of like run one of these because it is very cooperative and just doing different scenarios. And then there was another that came to mind, but it has since slipped my mind. So if I think of it again, I'll mention it.
I want everyone's recommendation because the class I teach, we go through steps of starting with interactive fiction, and then we lead up to bigger games. So these one-page games are super important in that transition of learning what games are and how to create them. The one that I play in class is called the Terrible RPG. It's a one-page game, TEAR, terrible. And you write your character on a character sheet by writing your character's name, and then you write the things that the character is good at. To see if you succeed, you tear pieces of your character sheet. Say you're good at safe cracking. So you write safe cracking. You have to tear a letter out of safe cracking out of the sheet, and then it has to be big enough to cover this tiny square that's on the one-page game. If you do that with just one tear without readjusting your grip, you succeed. If you fail, you take your hand off, you don't tear a big enough square, etc. You fail. And that's how your hit points go down, by tearing into your sheet. So that's a super fun game, super easy to teach, and you can also get into some deeper game design philosophies based on that. So that's the one I go to. Honey Heist is awesome. We've talked about that here before. And so is Lasers and Feelings, is another one-page game that is fun to play. It shows how to very easily create and run and play a role-playing game that is its full thing, but it's just meant for a one shot and you're done.
Fiasco. I can't not mention Fiasco. I love Fiasco. Really fun to just, off the wall come up with stuff. And the mechanics are so loose. It's just basically, do you want to start a scene or do you want to end a scene for your character? Yeah, resolve, establish or resolve. And that's basically the core mechanic. There are a couple other things there about was your character successful in their scene or not, as decided by the rest of the table. But there's no hit points, there's no hit dice, there's no roll to attack, there's none of that sort of stuff. You just kind of, it feels like an improv comedy show, the game, basically, which I really enjoy about it. The other two I'm going to mention, they're both by Australian creators. They can be played as campaigns, but I really enjoyed them just in the short sessions that I sort of played. The first is The Good Society by the Story Brewers. I played that recently. And it felt kind of like an English Fiasco to me a little bit. Maybe that was just the way we were playing it, but it was very kind of inventive and improv-y and that sort of thing. And I also enjoyed Dark Vigil, which is by Fractal RPG, who are another Australian creator. Dark Vigil has a kind of cooler Cthulhu vibe to it. Your characters might die or become mutated or whatever happens to them throughout the course of the game. As you try to succeed at ability checks, you can call on the darkness that has invaded the world and constantly whispers in your ear. So that gives you a greater chance of succeeding, but it also means that you're risking corruption as you play. It can be played as a campaign as well, I believe, and it's a little bit chunkier than one page necessarily. But what I liked about it was we had characters up and running within 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes before we played. Didn't feel like it had that barrier that 5e sometimes feels like it has to start a game or a campaign of why don't we just play 5e tonight? Wouldn't that be fun? And we'd have to create characters and that can take a long time. Do we want to use pre-gens? That sort of thing. So Dark Vigil, check it out. But speaking of small 1 to 4 page rules that can be played in a one shot, but also a campaign, I feel like I'm describing every RPG here in the world. Dimension 20 have recently put out a game completely for free through the Dropout web store. You can go grab it for free. It is called Never Stop Blowing Up, based on their recent live play that they did over the course of a couple of weeks. Bob, tell us about Never Stop Blowing Up. You brought this to my attention. What do you love about it?
I did. And before I tell you what I love about it, what I'd love to do is stop my cat from blowing up stuff behind me. I think you can hear that. I see the mic registering a little bit.
You know what this reminds me of? While Bob's doing that, this
Logan's
reminds me
bird?
of Logan's bird. That was wild.
Yeah.
No one other than
my
present.
I'm sorry, my cat just. Did you see that? My cat just brought in a bird. No, it went behind the fish tank.
What?
What is happening?
Anyway, good old Logan's bird. I mean, it was Logan's cat as well, but it was really the bird's fault.
It was
So Never Stop Blowing Up. Yeah. That came up. Somebody posted it in my Discord. I was aware of the show. I'm not like a follower on Dropout, but I watch a lot of the stuff they put on YouTube. And the fact that it was free, 4 pages, I was like, okay, I can read that today and maybe even crank out a video about it. So I almost did that. Video's not done yet, But anyway, the game is very simple, and essentially you start with, well, everybody has 9 skills in this game, and they all start using a D4. So instead of like a D20 for everything, you start at a D4 for everything. And then when you roll that skill, if you blow up, as in maxing it out, like roll a 4 for that skill when you're using it, then you also roll a D6. And then you would add that to your total for that roll. But then henceforth, whenever you use that skill, you use the D6, and then et cetera, potentially all the way up to D20. So apparently it gets really crazy. I can only imagine that after a few sessions, like a number of your characters could have really high in this context, like dice for the skills. So it made me wonder about like how you're setting these DCs. And it's really funny because in the 4-pager, there's a couple examples of scenes, of course, of like how this works. And I think it was like a DC 9 for a character to parkour up the Eiffel Tower. And maybe this is the perfect time, if I didn't say it already, the game system is supposed to be emulating a sort of like, in a way, cartoonish 80s action hero type of flick. So, and it seems to capture that pretty well.
It sounds very Fast and Furious-y as well.
Yeah. In fact, I think some of the, there's like group abilities you can unlock later. And I think one of them called La Familia is like a reference to that. Because, we've been Diesel and family is like the meme. But yeah.
Yeah, one of the checks is to fly a helicopter to the moon.
And I think that was only DC 16, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
Achievable.
What I think
Easily,
is really interesting
with a D20
about this is that it's a hack of Kids on Bikes, where in the base game of Kids on Bikes, or at least first edition, I still haven't checked out second, it uses exploding dice. It's not a mechanic original to Kids on Bikes, but it is central to Kids on Bikes. I'm not sure where it first appeared, but it's exploding dice.
Savage Worlds.
Savage. Thank you. I knew you would know. I knew you would. But you roll max on the dice and it explodes, and so you get to roll it again. And if it keeps exploding, it keeps exploding, is sort of how it works in Kids on Bikes. So even though in that system you choose a different die for each skill to represent how good you are at it, so the thing you're worst at, you get your D4.
Right.
You also are more likely to explode on the D4. So it kind of evens out in a way. But the maths of Kids on Bikes...
Sorry, can I ask a quick question? Yeah. Quick question is, in Kids on Bikes, because in Never Stop Blowing Up, when you blow up, forever henceforth, once you get to a D8 on a skill, that remains...
So what they've done, instead of exploding the die, right? Because exploding the die just means you rolled a 4 on the D4, so roll the D4 again and add the results together. So the next time you roll a D4, you're still only rolling a D4. Whereas the dice blow up instead of exploding. So you increase the die size forevermore. And it is interesting because the maths in Kids on Bikes is a little bit wonky in terms of probability. And I just think it's really funny that I also have hacked the Kids on Bikes system and went in entirely the opposite direction. I was like, how do I level this out and make it less extreme? And they were like, what if we made it so that you can fly a helicopter to the moon?
I like that. In the trailer that I watched for the season, there's a line, I think toward the end, that says, so the game is Never Stop Blowing Up. And it was like, never stop blowing up in a world where they tell you to always keep sucking down. And so it sounds like, maybe, I don't know, that could be a cool slogan for the reverse Never Stop Blowing Up game. But
love it.
The
Always
blowing up mechanic definitely feels...
Yes.
The blowing up mechanic feels very made for streaming in terms of big reactions at the table. When you blow up once, that's like, oh, awesome, I get to roll the dice again. But then I think they actually show a clip in one of the trailers of somebody blowing up a second time on the same roll. And the excitement kind of builds. I can see that being a lot of fun. What I also like is the injury mechanic. There's only 4 stages of injury or 3 stages of injury before dead. Superficial is no negative effect.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything.
But you've got that wound there. You're kind of one further down the counter. once you get a severe wound, that's when you start to get a penalty. We're spending turbo tokens, which is a type of currency that you can spend to increase your rolls. You have to spend more turbo tokens to achieve the same effect, so it gets harder to use. Then when you take the third level, Adrenalized, I believe all that happens is you just get 10 turbo tokens. So it's just like, all right, you're almost dead, but you're, John McClane walking on glass, crawling around like, you've been burned, you've been crushed, you've been sliced. And you can see in the trailers as well, Brennan, who's GMing it, just getting more and more beat up looking through each, I assume, episode as you get closer. So I like the idea that this game just makes it like more and more exciting as you go through the session or the campaign before you get to the end.
One thing that was interesting, I'm curious if any of you maybe picked up on it, or I don't know how much if anyone else has caught the show outside of checking out the PDF, but I did not see a way to heal injuries. So I was assuming that it must just be like narrative, because that is kind of the way of an action movie where it's like, oh, my arm just got pretty much blown off. Okay, here's a bandage and you'll be great to go in the next scene. So yeah, I don't know if they actually address it or not, but that was just something that caught my eye. I was curious if anybody else saw it.
Heroes don't have time to stop and heal.
Well, the quick healing ability lets you recover an injury level at the end of an encounter. So
Right.
I would assume that you can,
Yeah, it makes me
it's funny.
assuming end of a session, then it's
took-
probably the default. But
Right. We took a question today on Mastering Dungeons about how technology has changed the way games are presented and written. And all three of you have said, and as I was watching the trailer, I was watching the video, and I
I
didn't
never
watch the
said
video.
such a thing.
Sorry,
but I
Dale.
thought it.
Yes. So, but I only read the rules, and so the game the fan of fun things in me is like, oh, this sounds cool, and the game designer in me is twitching like you would not believe, and I'm just like, and it's sad to be a game designer. Yes, you can quote me on that. When you're reading something, the first thing you do is pick up a pencil, and you're like, no, okay, if we did. And so that's how I came at this, because watching a game of this being played would be hilarious. Playing a game of this, if you did not have the perfect group, would be torture.
Sure.
And, we've talked about closet dramas before on the show, plays that were meant to be read but not performed. And it's almost like this is a closet game. It's meant to be watched but not played, or read but not played, because it just, again, if you don't have the right group, it's going to be, oh, that was fun for 2 hours, let's never do that again, or why are we doing this? And so it's an interesting thing to look at in terms of the presentation and the playability of a game, just as a game, not as a tool for entertaining, or really what this is a marketing tool to get people to come watch their show, which is fine. That's not detrimental in any way. It's just interesting because, I'm like making a list of all the game design stuff, and I'm like, I can't even anymore. This is its own thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that my impression of what happened here, again, they put it up for free on their website, and it seems like it was invented for the stream because they had an exciting idea about like, hey, how can we create a new fun show that people will engage with? And then, I don't know, I think they did mention this somewhere. I don't know if it was in the description of the product or it was somewhere else where I read like they had kind of acknowledged like, we're not game designers. We've never put out like a product like this before, blah, blah, blah. But people have been asking us for it. So you know what? Here are the rules if you want to give it a go in your own house. And yeah, I think it's also interesting what you've said there, because as someone who undiagnosed, but definitely seem to have ADHD tendencies of like, I find it really difficult to read rule books cover to cover. I never read the 2014 DMG cover to cover. I don't think I ever read the Player's Handbook 2014 cover to cover, to the point where I would sometimes have players surprise me with rules 2 years after I'd been GMing, and I'd be like, wait, what? And go in and find this very specific kind of thing somewhere. So I downloaded the rules for this. I had a scan through of them, but at the same time, I was watching a video. I think it's by Bonus Action is the YouTube channel. They did a really great kind of explainer of how these rules work. And for me, it was kind of like, let's get the big rocks in, because when I get to the abilities page, which is just like a list of abilities, kind of like spells, I'm like, yeah, I don't need to know all of those. Like if I'm just kind of getting an impression of this game, like I don't need to know the details of all of them, because if they come up in game, I'll figure out what they do then as it becomes relevant to me. But I can imagine, Shawn, from a game designer perspective, oh no, there are some things in there that, like, you know, maybe not in this necessarily, but like, let's say 5th edition, there are some feats, there are some spells or whatever that a GM should know what they do, or a game designer should know what they do, because of how they interact with other aspects of the game.
And this, like I said, this isn't meant to really be played, and that's okay. It's a 4-page free thing that this is how this group has prompts to tell our fun and ridiculous and amazing stories. And so everybody enjoy. And that's totally cool. Yeah, I got to the 37 abilities. Yes, I counted them because brain. I was like, okay, let's take a look. One of them says wild card. What does that do? It says you are a wild card. And I'm like, okay, what? Did I miss a wild card somewhere? And there is no description of what wild card means or does.
Sure.
Yeah, so this is the curse of a game designer, is having to just enjoy something, but you can't. You can't, because it is there and must therefore be analyzed and gamified. And yeah, I apologize to everyone.
No, I've got the same thing with cinema. My like year 9 media teacher apologized to the whole class when he said, we're about to start cinema studies. You'll never watch a movie the same again. I apologize. And watching Arcane season 2, no spoilies, was a little bit difficult for me in the first 3 episodes. I managed to switch it off by the time we got later into the season, but it's because I was like, I'd analyzed the hell out of season 1 so much. I was looking at season 2, go, okay, I see why they've done the framing here, and yes, I see why they've done there, and this is what that says about this relationship. Oh, the lighting here is really interesting. Oh, they've changed the music tone, you know. And trying to switch that off and just kind of enjoy a thing can be difficult when you're, you know, it's kind of like learning how close-up magic is done. The more you know how the trick is done, the less you understand.
Working in a restaurant,
the less magical it seems. Yeah. Yes, your waiters talk about you back of house. Speaking of talking about you back of house, behind the scenes, MCDM were working with D&D Beyond to get the Illrigger, the first third-party class to make it to D&D Beyond since the Blood Hunter, way back in the day, has gotten onto D&D Beyond. Dael, as our resident MCDM person on call, tell us about the Illrigger.
So the Illrigger is a class that came out of the Chain of Acheron, which was a brief but very popular actual play series they were doing. It feels weird calling it an actual play series, because that makes it sound like it was like planned as a piece of entertainment more than being like, hey, we're going to play this game, we're going to stream it as well. So, you know, they put in the energy to production quality, but it was intended kind of more as, we're playing this in the office and we're going to show it to you. And people are still so devastated that it did not continue. But during that game, Anna, who's just the best, played a character called Judge, who is a tiefling who is basically a knight of hell. So like kind of in the vibes of like an evil paladin, but not an evil paladin. And so sort of they originally were looking at going with, what's the anti-paladin called?
Oathbreaker.
Oathbreaker. They originally were, I believe, looking at Oathbreaker, and then they were like, none of this is what I want this character to be. So they ended up kind of developing their own class. They thought about a subclass for a while, and they're like, no, none of the core class things are what we need. And so they developed their own actual class for it, and it kind of became its own thing. And they gave it its own release that was successful enough, and now you get to access it on D&D Beyond. So that's pretty exciting.
Definitely is. It is up for $14.99 at the moment US on D&D Beyond for folks that are interested. My understanding, so it was first published in Arcadia 2021, I believe. I don't know if you're going to correct me on any of this, Dael.
That
Feel
sounds
free
about
to.
right. That sounds about right.
Then it got revised in 2023, so towards the end of last year, they did kind of a revision which added some subclasses and whatnot. That's the version that's gone on to D&D Beyond. Just because I saw a couple of folks asking when I was looking at this through Reddit and different places, I don't believe it's gotten another revision for D&D 2024, so it doesn't have things like weapon masteries, but the system's all like that. A wizard doesn't have weapon masteries either, so it's all still completely compatible with 5th edition. But that's cool. It's awesome to see, D&D Beyond continuing to open itself up and kind of become the Steam of the tabletop RPG industry, at least as far as 5th edition is concerned, I suppose. I know some people will be screaming at me for saying that.
As someone who will have a class maybe going up onto D&D Beyond at some point in the future, I'm very interested in seeing how this one is accepted and talked about and used. I saw the original Illrigger a long, long time ago. I did not see the updated version. When I saw we were going to be talking about it, I went on to D&D Beyond and bought it. And D&D Beyond refused to show it to me until about 35 minutes ago. So I had the chance to just quickly skim it. And I don't have too much else to add other than I love the concept. I enjoy the heck out of MCDM stuff. I think Sadie Lowry may have been involved in the creation of this. And she's an amazing creator, editor, etc. So I hope people enjoy it. Can't wait to see the discussion about how third-party classes, which are much more intricate and in need of testing than subclass or other rules elements. So it'll be interesting to see the acceptability rate of the class in the eyes of players.
Yeah, don't go into the YouTube comments on on the official D&D Beyond video, because I did just kind of trying to take the temperature, and
Honestly,
YouTube's going to YouTube.
Don't go into the comments underneath any D&D Beyond video ever.
That's probably
Except
wise.
Except ours. Our audience is always really happy.
Especially when we talk about AI.
Yeah. Well, they love that. But it's also going to be interesting to see whether any other MCDM sort of 5e specific classes that they made end up getting D&D Beyond releases or not, because they also had the Beast Heart, which was... like they were like, the Beastmaster Ranger is stupid, ignore it. We've made this whole separate class for if you want to have a pet. So that it'd be interesting to see whether D&D would want to put that on D&D Beyond or not. And on top of that, MCDM are doing Beast Heart for Draw Steel. So it's like all these other little elements in it, not to mention the talent and what's going on there. So I don't know. Interesting to see what this opens up in the future.
Yeah. For sure. I mean, Shawn, you kind of danced around it a little bit before. It's not a secret. We advertised it on the Kickstarter. The Monster Hunter shall one day find its way onto D&D Beyond. So I think we're only going to see more of this, which is cool to see, what different people come up with. I also don't think D&D Beyond is too concerned about sort of thematic double-ups, if you know what I mean, like in terms of Beast Heart versus the Ranger. There was an example of one where a third part, I can't remember what it was. I can't even remember if it was us, something like a monster in the Lairs of Etheris that kind of felt like a little bit of a double up with, or even Flea Mortals has like its own version of a wyvern and has its own version of like all these different monsters that are not necessarily meant to replace the core monster manual versions of those monsters, but are definitely not always putting a twist on them in terms of like thematically, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Ben, you don't have to worry about that
about that.
Because even D&D just replaced or will soon be replacing all of its monsters, right? Without tweaking most of them, I think. So, or, rearranging our stat blocks, of course. But yeah, so there's going to be plenty of versions of all these things up there.
That actually was a question. I don't think it will be, but with the Illrigger technically still being designed for 2014, people were asking, like, with more third-party content going up there, if it's not designed specifically for D&D 2024, will it get the legacy tag of like, hey, this is 2014 content technically, or will they not make that distinction with third-party content? Does it matter because it's so compatible? I mean, aside from weapon masteries, which is me just making an assumption that class would have weapon masteries based on the fact that it's a martial-ish kind of class. You know, what else would it need to be fully quote unquote compatible? Like just the wording, as Shawn likes to keep reminding us, has the X condition as opposed to being X. Yeah. Anyway, there's that. Go check it out. Speaking of Wizards of the Coast, this one might be a quick one. There's not really much news in here. I'm looking at all the writing I did for this on the run sheet, but, you know, Chris Cox had an interview with Bloomberg. Famous Eldritch Lorecast character keeps recurring, Chris Cox. Hasbro.
He's like our mascot.
He's no longer going to be... Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there you go. Hasbro... No, I thought Dael's mum was our mascot. Chris Cox is no longer... Well, Hasbro is no longer going to be co-financing films based on their IP. So my understanding is D&D Honor Among Thieves and the recent Transformers 1 movie were co-financed, at least in some capacity, by Hasbro. They will no longer be doing that. That's not to say there won't be future movies based on their IPs, but it's not something that they will be looking to put money into as a company themselves. Cox saying that Hasbro really want to focus on interactive entertainment, being toys, tabletop, and very notably video games and the video game industry. So Sony and Lionsgate still have or are still able to, if they want to, create more movies for Hasbro IPs. It's not a closed door on an Honor Among Thieves sequel, but somebody would have to be game to do it. That's not Hasbro.
Just brief pause. My mother has responded. And she says patron saint maybe instead of mascot.
Oh, yeah, no, I prefer that. Yeah, definitely.
I knew she was watching.
Kind of related to that news, there are apparently Chris, just kind of Mr. Cox, Mr. Chris Cox of Hasbro, his Hasbro CEO, Sir Cox, has mentioned that there is apparently an unannounced D&D video game in the works, to nobody's surprise. Hasbro currently planning to get to a point where they're releasing 1 to 2 games a year, video games that is, by 2026, excluding third-party games.
Can we just briefly
Exodus,
touch on that? That's an insane goal. 1 to 2 games
does anybody do that?
year?
I'm not really tuned
not
in.
Including third-party? Yeah, 2 a year in-house? What? The only way to do that is if the games are shit and the developers are overworked.
Okay.
Well, you just described the whole game industry right there, so I can't. I don't know. Where do
Shawn
we go?
with the steel chair.
The humorous part is Wizards of the Coast, I believe, has several video game companies under their umbrella. There are separate, discrete pieces of Wizards of the Coast / Hasbro working on video games right now. The humorous part is Chris said that they want to focus on toys, tabletop, and video games. Every time they speak to the public, they say that the toy industry is just cratering, and we should get out of that. Let me just clarify, because when I if you read that from the run sheet, those are definitely my words, not necessarily Chris Cox's. I think in the interview, if you go back and look at it, he says interactive play and then doesn't necessarily tie that exclusively to video games. So I kind of took that to mean he means, things that people interact with, toys, tabletop, video games. Gotcha.
But the focus of the interview certainly goes towards video games more so than it does toys. Still
hilarious, because we know that the video game industry as a whole has been laying people off like crazy. What happened was the movie didn't do as well as they'd hoped, and Baldur's Gate 3 did better than they'd hoped. And the investors are watching, and they're like, what do you do? What are we going to do with our money? Are we going to give it to Hasbro? So what do they need to hear? They need to hear we're going to put it in video games, because look at how well video games, or at least our video game, is doing. When every video game that they put out in the next 2 years bombs, some movie's going to come along that does great, and then they're going to switch and they're going to dump all of this money into movies, and they're going to buy a movie studio, and they're going to say, look, now... And then in 3 years, when every movie they make flops, they're going to say, whoa, it's just, they're talking, Hasbro leadership, Chris Cox, they're talking to investors. Go ahead, Bob. Sorry.
I would say, but by then, surely the TTRPGs will finally rise up, right? And I doubt it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
This is exactly what I was saying when I was reading about this, though, because it really does feel like, you know, when the movie didn't go well, we read Chris Cox saying, yeah, man, movies are just too expensive. They're just too expensive. We got to get out of the movie game. And then the choice to then go into, we're going to put all our eggs in video games. Not all our eggs, maybe. We're going to put a lot of eggs into video games, as though making video games is not an expensive option. Like, what? Who's making these choices? Because I don't think they're in the video game world. And that schedule idea, I just keep thinking about when Assassin's Creed was at its peak and they were really working hard to release one Assassin's Creed game every year. And they had two massive dev teams working simultaneously on games, like separate games, so that they would basically have a 2-year time and they would stagger the releases. And those games were like renowned for how buggy they were. So it's not even one a year that they want to release. 1 to 2 a year.
I would imagine that like maybe we're thinking too much in our D&D bubble here of like huge open world, highly rendered fantasy games, and they could totally be talking about more, you know, Monopoly Go type games, which I think was like they're
Gacha
even
games,
bigger than Baldur's Gate by a long shot. Actually, I don't know the numbers, but I heard them long ago. But yeah, I think the mobile game Monopoly Go, where you press go and then a character moves around a board, you make some amount of money, and then like a building appears or something, and like that's all you do. Like that's the whole game, and that was like their most profitable thing in many years, I believe. So I think a number of these games could be like that. Maybe easier to make. I don't really know.
Right.
Yeah.
You're completely right, and you know that it's sort of specifically mobile gaming is and you know still online games on like Facebook and stuff. Surprisingly, are hugely. They represent a massive portion of the gaming industry that gets overlooked by fans of gaming. You know, pretty much the largest percentage of the gaming population is like women 40 and above, because they play a lot of these sort of mobile games and Facebook games.
And handing the phone or iPad to their child,
Yes, and it earns bucket loads of money. But what is interesting about that is, even if, because I do think you're right, I think that I would be surprised if there wasn't some of that representing part of this plan, and specifically because of the success of Monopoly Go. But even then, why would you release new ones every year rather than just like putting all your money into the successful mobile game that you already, you know what I mean? Like
the problem is they did not make these games. They did not make Monopoly Go. They did not make Baldur's Gate 3. Wizards of the Coast or Hasbro did not make those games. They licensed that out to other people who spent a lot of money to make the game what it is. You can't just ramp up a studio and everything hit the ground running and you just make this perfect game in a year or 2 or 3 or 4. And now you own everything as opposed to just getting a small licensing fee for it. But there seems to be this idea in the C-suite world that, well, if this company did it, then we can do it. We're even bigger than this other company. So we should be able to just throw this money at it and have it work swimmingly. And so far, there has not been a lot of swimming. There's been a lot of drowning in that sort of attitude toward making these things.
We should start placing bets. We should be like, okay, we're going to have at least some kind of a collectible card game where you get like treasure chests that are like loot box style randomized. That's what my bet is.
Yeah. Can you imagine if Hasbro like next year announces their entry into the console market? That'd be great.
The console wars
like they just want to be Microsoft. Yeah. Well, you know, there's a lot of rumor going around that Microsoft are looking at getting out of the console market because they had an ad go out recently that was like, your phone is an Xbox, this is an Xbox, because they're, I think, creating a new streaming. Anyway, this is not a video game podcast, so I don't know the details. You can't blame me for it. But anyway, it was interesting. Exodus, I will say, in the vein of that AAA looking game, I have hope for Exodus. which is I believe even the publisher or the game developer is called Exodus. No, it's called Gameloft. My apologies.
Archetype Entertainment is making Exodus. They're an Austin-based game development company owned by Hasbro.
That looks like it's come a long way. Their website's very fleshed out. It's very pretty. It looks extremely Mass Effect-y. I have hopes for that only because as a fan of Mass Effect, I would love another kind of space opera RPG to sink my teeth into. Bubbling away. The investment's been maybe more than a year or two in the making, but it will be interesting to see what they can come up with aside from that one game that looks interesting to me, currently speaking. Thank you, Shawn. I was looking at Gameloft, who are making a survival life sim set in the Forgotten Realms, and Starbreeze Entertainment are also working on a D&D game. All of these apparently separate from the unannounced D&D game that Chris Cox was referring to. So there are stokes in the fire, pokes in the fire, something's in the fire. There are things in the fire. We'll see if those dragon eggs will hatch. Anyway, speaking of fire and hell, get ready for your political part of the Eldritch Lorecast. No, not really. This is a little bit of a fun story and completely silly. We're in the darkest timeline. Elon Musk tells Hasbro to burn in hell is basically the headline for this. To take the story back a little bit, Mark Kern, who is a video game developer, but also apparently turned to kind of culture warring in more recent days. Yes. Posted a Twitter criticism of the foreword, which is written inside of the making of original Dungeons and Dragons, the history book that Wizards of the Coast have put out to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the 50th anniversary of D&D. We've talked about this on the Lorecast before. That book, I believe, is now just available to purchase, so anybody can go out and grab it and read it. And Mark Kern was particularly outraged by passages from the foreword written by John Peterson, which, and I read these passages very lightly, talked about how D&D in its conception was not always made for a diverse audience. And that it used many tropes that could offend folks in today's kind of broader D&D audience. Talks about misogynistic jokes that were made in the earlier kind of publications made for D&D, representations of women, representations of disability that were not always, the most considered that they could be, and how the game has come a long way since then to be more inclusive and more accessible to a broader audience. But just says in the pages of this history book, you may come across some things that are part of the history of the game that we didn't want to sand off the edges of to present it as it was, but it's in there. And so Mark Kern tweeted about this, saying that Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast are trying to erase Gary Gygax's influence on the game, his legacy. They're trying to get rid of it, pretend that it never happened. And replying to Kern's tweet, Elon Musk decided to weigh in, saying, quote, "Nobody, and I mean nobody, gets to trash Gary Gygax and the geniuses who created Dungeons and Dragons. What the F word, because Dante will be mad at me, is wrong with Hasbro and WotC, may they burn in hell."
To me, it's like kind of one more piece of what I feel like is kind of like crying wolf toward Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast, where it's like this is as you said, like it's not like super heavy-handed saying like really harsh things about these guys, about these creators who obviously did great things for what all of us do today. But it does point it out. And my only take on that is like, yeah, maybe it's like a little longer. Like they probably could have kept that section shorter than it ended up being. But it feels to me that it ends up, feeding into this almost like a news cycle, I guess, where then, because there's so much outrage about every little thing Hasbro or Wizards of the Coast do, that I feel like it diminishes valid criticisms of them, because then people are just able to write it off as like, oh, you just hate Hasbro, oh, you just hate Wizards of the Coast, and it's like, no, like they aren't always the best steward of the game. And this kind of thing just washes it all together. Yeah,
I agree. I mean, it's definitely it's probably not the right term, but like a wolf whistle to this kind of culture war crap that I just like. Look, to be honest, I didn't really put this on the run on the news, on the run sheet, sorry, on the news cycle, whatever term I want to use, to engage in the kind of, should this be written in the book, should it not, blah, 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 blah. I think it's good to contextualize any historical work so that folks know what it is that they're looking at. But there are just some like factually incorrect things in both Mark Kern's tweets and Elon's kind of assumptions, such as this idea that Gary Gygax or Dave Arneson are being erased and their legacy, their names are being erased from the game, because in the front of the player's handbook for the 2024 game, at least, both Gary and Dave are directly credited as the creators of the original game that this new version of the game is based upon. And Chris Perkins talks about Gary Gygax in the introduction, the forward, if you will, to the player's handbook. So if anything, Wizards of the Coast are kind of participating in the continued celebration of that legacy, you know, whether it's deifying or not.
And the other point is here that, because I made a little video about this today, as we're recording this, and the thing I kind of wish I emphasized more that I think we can emphasize here is that remember that this, caveat, whatever you want to call it, like content warning even, is at the beginning of a 500-page book honoring these guys' creation. It's not just, and they're credited in the new player's handbook. And they're mentioned in the new player's handbook. No, they republished their original materials in the original draft of the game, in all its glory, however you want to look at that, to praise like the 50-year tradition of D&D and even what came before it. Like that's really what this book was about, like the steps building up to that original release.
I don't know, Bob, I'm pretty sure it's only 40 years. Pretty sure.
Yeah. Who knows? Because, facts, whatever.
Mark Kern incorrectly said that it was the 40th anniversary of D&D. Now, to be charitable and not sort of wolf whistle ourselves, that could easily be like a typo or a slip of the keyboard.
That's true.
But it's still funny. It's still funny that that was
How dare he erase 10 years of D&D?
Maybe that's what he was saying. He was like, they're trying to get rid of the first 10 years and act as if it's only the 40th. Yes. Yeah, I would encourage folks, again, the reason I threw this on the run sheet is just so that if people hear about this on Twitter or whatever, they have further context to it so that they're not hearing about it for the first time from some weird... Yeah, exactly. From some weird direction. But just to set the record straight and not engage in the more kind of culture war-y aspects of this, because it's not really what the book's about. And it's not useful, I don't think. Polygon published an article saying that tabletop creators are indeed ditching Twitter for Bluesky. I think Twitter has lost something like 100,000 subscribers users, whatever the right term is, since the start of November. That's not a huge number for Twitter, for the record. But on the flip side of that, Bluesky, which had about 9 million users. It's a significant number for such a short
period of time, but it's not,
Sure.
Great. Yeah.
I think it's considered like the biggest drop of users in a short period of time that Twitter's had in a while. But yes, Bluesky, September, they had 9 million users. I assume that's just the last place that we can kind of really pinpoint how many users were using Bluesky. And that has exploded out to 22.3 million at the time that I was writing the run sheet. That might be higher now because they were gaining new users at a rate of like 5 new users a second. So, yeah. And there's lots of folks on Bluesky. We talked last week. I'm on Bluesky. Sean's on Bluesky. Dael, you look like you poked in.
Yeah.
Looked in through the door on Bluesky and then closed it again.
Trying. I mean, in the name of, transparency and even-handedness, I tried to post on Bluesky and then it was down and wouldn't let me post anything. And so then I had to just keep my tweet, whatever the Bluesky equivalent of a tweet is, and reattempt hours later. So it was a more arduous endeavor than I wanted it to be. But I'm,
sure.
I have replaced on my home screen on my phone, I've replaced Twitter with Bluesky. I still have Twitter. hopeful of what will happen. It's definitely more active than before, but it's still, my habitual going and checking and refreshing doesn't necessarily yield that many more posts. And that's probably just a sign that I'm not following enough people. So I just,
that and Bluesky also doesn't have I was doing a bit of reading on this, but I might butcher the facts, so bear with me. Bluesky doesn't have an algorithm in the way that Twitter does.
Sure, but I always have my Twitter set to just most recent tweets from people I follow anyway.
Yeah, okay. Bluesky does have its own, has moderation tools and different things. Apparently you can create search, your own kind of search engines or create your own algorithm of the sort of stuff that you want to see on there. I haven't really dabbled in that too much. I have noticed my feed is a lot more active, and usually I'm only seeing who I've followed anyway as well. Alpha Stream, good old Teos, trying to encourage us to come over to Mastodon. I think the problem with Mastodon is that the whole server thing just, I think, confused too many people on Twitter. And Bluesky is so
familiar
on its face, similar to Twitter, that it's a much easier translation.
Honestly, the minute Bluesky adds drafts, I think it will win me over forever. I have to assume that's on their list of things to do. Because I have stupid thoughts in the dead of night, and I don't post them because I'm like, well, I need someone to see it.
Leading on from a conversation we had last week, Andrew asked via emailing Shawn. Where did Andrew email?
I believe that Andrew emailed podcast@ghostfiregaming.com.
And Andrew asked, we were talking about false rumors last week, and how, you can implant some story that the party did, at least that's what I was saying, that they did off over here, and then they get into town, it turns out it's not true. Andrew's saying that when he's tried to use false rumors in their adventures, they feel like red herrings at best, or that the players have been lied to. It often leaves players feeling like their time was wasted if they start following a false rumor that turns out to not be true. How do you make false rumors work? How do you make them interesting? Is it a play style thing, or is Andrew missing a trick?
I feel like the way to do that is to make sure that, the rumor's still enticing and it may be incorrect, but the truth is way more exciting. It's just what you have to do. Whatever they actually find out, oh my gosh, it wasn't, because I don't know, the first example that came to mind was a rumor that I used in a one-shot that I wrote last year. And there were a handful of rumors, but one of them was that there's oh crap. Man, it's slipping my mind now. But the point is, it's got to either be more exciting. Or, and it always must have a grain of truth. It can't be a literal red herring just distracting them from whatever they want to do. But yeah, I think it was something along the lines of there's a creature that's been accosting or, robbing travelers or something. And then it's this actual giant who's kidnapping people for, I don't know, some more joyful purpose, I guess. Whatever it was something very whimsical, but I can't remember it now fully.
I love false rumors being almost a puzzle in themselves. So I particularly love using false rumors in connection with stuff that the players know contradict with that. You know what I mean? Like they hear this rumor out and about town and they go, but wait, we know that doesn't make sense because of this. Because then they can start piecing it together. And in that way, it feels a little bit like, your Witcher style, there's some creature is, I don't know, a witch has been cursing the livestock, but you slowly figure out it's, I don't know, some horrible bunyip creature. But, I love doing things like that.
There's a reference no one else will get. Shawn, do you know what a bunyip is?
I heard of a bunyip.
No.
It's a type of vegetable. Go on, Dael.
Yeah.
Oh, it's like a turnip.
Yeah. Sure. So I love using false rumors in that kind of a context. I love, if we're talking about the kind of false rumors that we briefly mentioned last time, I like it when you can sort of see the way it has just evolved from the truth. I like it still coming from a nugget of truth rather than just being a blatant lie. The only context in which I think I have done blatant mistruths as rumors and I think it fits in with what Bob was saying, was in a campaign context where there's like, this major central city state that the sort of High King is like keeping everything from turning to all out war. And I ended up having this sort of background thing where I knew that the king was dead and didn't have an heir. There was no one to take over the throne. And so the like secret police of that kingdom had been deliberately sending out people to talk about, like bad decisions the king has made and like seeding a little bit of ferment that is like anti the king, because that was the most effective way of getting people to really believe that the king was still alive so that things wouldn't like fall into absolute chaos. So that was kind of like a fun little reveal to have in my back pocket as things go on. So I don't know, there's definitely ways that you can play with it, but I think Bob is absolutely right. It's gotta, if you're gonna lie to your players, the truth has to be really exciting.
And you use these rumors as a tool to get the experience you want out of the game for your players. So think about, before you do it, what's going to be the consequence of this? If one of the rumors is, oh, there's a really exciting bit of treasure in this mountain, and they go off to that mountain, and you're like, I don't know what to do. I didn't think they would follow this, right? That's just a red herring that doesn't do anything. And even if you then put something there, it's sort of anticlimactic or antithetical to what you actually want. Whereas a piece of information that's false that leads to a discovery that is, as Bob said, more exciting than the rumor was, or leads to the characters being put into a situation that's fun that they need to get out of. In the original Keep on the Borderlands, there was a rumor that the word Briarch in Goblin means we surrender. Now that was false. That rumor is false. What it means is basically an insult in Goblin, with the idea being you're going to go off into these caves with the goblins, you're going to get into trouble, you're going to yell Briarch, and they are going to be even more angry, which you will then have to talk your way out of. So if you do use rumors, false or otherwise, stop and draw out the consequences of the characters believing it. What will be fun about the game if they do, but how they can also get out of it if they do follow this line, and then you don't want the consequences to be instant death unless you give them lots of opportunity to figure out that this information was false.
Took the words right out of my mouth. Something, don't know the rest of that song, but yes. I do not need to add anything because you all said it all.
That was beautiful.
So perfectly.
But I Googled a bunch.
We got to end with a dance party.
What did Google tell you, Bob?
Yeah, and I definitely like just recognized vaguely that this is a mythological or like folklore creature of apparently Aboriginal Australia, but none of the images look familiar at all, and there's a lot of different looking creatures here. So I like that there's many different forms this thing seems to take.
I had a little book as a kid. It was basically like how the Grinch stole Christmas, but it was how the Bunyip stole Easter, and it was all the Easter bilbies. Bilbies are like a real Australian
actual
animal that's kind of like a rabbit. Yeah, they're all dying off because of the introduction of rabbits to Australia. Anyway, on that happy note, we're going to end the Eldritch Lorecast right there. If you've enjoyed,
Go read The
you
Rabbits
can join
by
us
Shawn
again
Tan.
next week. We will be back streaming 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on a Monday, Tuesday, 10 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. Next week is the last episode, I believe, where we will be live. We will be doing streamed episodes at that time afterwards, but those will be pre-records, just so everybody knows. If we're not ignoring you, chat. We're just not aware that you're there. But until then, I just want to say very quickly, thank you, Bob, as well, for joining us for the last 2 episodes. Where can folks find you if they want to check out your video on the Elon Gate?
Well, it's on YouTube, of course. Bob World Builder is the name of the channel. And I did today, of course, after Elon comments on D&D, I was like, okay, I can make a blue sky now. I don't know how much I'm going to use it, but it exists, and the video is also posted there.
I followed Bob on Blue Sky
thank you,
today.
Shawn.
Yeah,
Great. The community is already growing. I love it.
exactly.
Otherwise, if you've enjoyed listening, like, stars, all that stuff, subscribes if you want to, comment on Spotify. It's a thing, but make sure you pull over first or dry your hands if you're washing the dishes, whatever you happen to be doing. I've been Ben Byrne, here with Bob Worldbuilder, Shawn Merwin, Dael Kingsmill, and we will catch you next week for another episode of the Eldritch Lorecast. Babada, babada, babada. Babada, ba. Babada, ba.
Bob.
Yeah.
Babada, ba.
Oh, man, I wish I thought of that earlier. Babada, ba.
It doesn't stand out to us because we say Bob with such an You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, we do. Bob.
Yeah.
Bab.
Anyway.
Well, yeah, thanks, guys.
No, thank you. Thank you for joining us again. I appreciate it.